Well, this is particularly appropriate that we should be having such a splendid meal this evening, since this year is the 10th anniversary since the founding of the Winwood Institute. And so we managed, despite the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune coming from various spots around the globe, we have managed to struggle through. And it's marvellous to see all of you here and recognise many faces that have become familiar over these 10 years. If you have been receiving our emails, then there's no need for me to introduce Robert Reilly. But in the case that you haven't been receiving our emails and then have been living in the outer darkness, then it might not hurt to have to know a couple of things, of the remarkable things that he has succeeded in doing. He was for a time head of the Voice of America during the days when, very early, at the beginning of the current century, when America was under attack and the Voice of America was the centerpiece of the line of battle of the United States in the intellectual war of ideas that was being carried on internationally. In addition to that, he has published a number of books. Two of them really stand out. One of these is a book on Islam, which remains to this day, in my judgment, one of the very best books in existence about Islam, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, how intellectual suicide created the modern Islamist crisis. He details in a suspenseful style how the Sunni Islamic world expelled philosophy and the use of reason from its schools and from its teachings. And so this has had the most terrible consequences, as you know well, but consequences of a kind which our own society appears to be, to some extent, intent on imitating. His other excellent book is, of all things, on the best of contemporary classical music, a good counterpoint. Surprised by Beauty, a study of a considerable number of 50 or 60 of the best composers of classical music in our own day. Anyway, I think we'll leave it at that, Bob, unless his topic tonight, as you know, is America and the Middle East. So please give Bob a warm.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Ladies and gentlemen, what a delight to be with you today. I haven't eaten either, so I'll try to keep my remarks extremely brief. This is, in a way, a homecoming for me because I have lived in this area before in several iterations with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. I lived both in Bryn Mawr and I lived in Radnor. So going through 30th Street Station today was a nostalgic experience. I love this part of the country. Congratulations to you, Winwood Institute, for 10 years. I can tell you from my lair in Northern Virginia how jealous I am of you because I get Patrick's emails, announcements of lectures, and most especially important, the seminars. And I'm particularly jealous because of what I'm working on now of the seminar that Patrick is doing on John Locke. I've even sent a spy to sit in on the sessions and report back to me. At least that's what Patrick accused me of today. But Ted Furton is not a spy. He's a he himself is a philosopher, as interested as I in this subject. So congratulations, Patrick. Congratulations, Winwood Institute. Now, the subject of America in the Middle East, as interesting as it is for us, actually doesn't have all that long a history. Certainly we all remember the Barbary pirates and the troubles of the early Republic and Jefferson. But aside from that, a great lacuna opens, and there's not much heard about the Middle East. It certainly captured a part of the American imagination in the sort of Arabian Nights kind of way, and most particularly maintained its importance in an evangelical and religious way because of the importance of Jerusalem for Christians and Jews. So yes, that certainly sustained itself. But we didn't really have any strategic interest in the Middle East. And that's why the history is so brief. Not much to say throughout most of the 19th century. The feeling was apparently mutual, as no Middle Eastern country opened an embassy in Washington until the Ottoman Empire did in 1873. It was not until 1909 that the U.S. State Department created an Office of Near Eastern Affairs division. The Assistant Secretary of State, Francis Huntington Wilson, in 1913 said, quote, "It's no place for us to waste ammunition," unquote. Well, apparently something changed. By the way, here might be an interesting historical note for you. Back in 1844, I think that was before neoconservatism existed, there was a book regarding the sometimes millenarian views Christians have about Jerusalem, calling for the recreation of the Jewish Palestine. The book was called The Valley of Vision, or The Dry Bones of Israel Revived. It was written by George Bush. Yes, an ancestor of George W. Bush. Now, our stance toward the Middle East comported with our general orientation as a republic. It was anti-imperialist. We had the view about the Arabs, as we do about most people, that should the boot of imperialism be lifted off their shoulders, they would naturally assume the blessings of liberty and self-government. What was preventing the exercise of that self-government? Well, it appeared it was the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the Middle East for several centuries. This, to a certain extent, was shared by some Brits as well, though as World War I broke out, the Sultan in Istanbul was made an offer by the British Empire: stay out of World War I, and we will guarantee the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. The foolish Sultan refused that generous offer. He had been courted by the Germans for some period of time. They entered the war, as a consequence of which, of course, the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, collapsed and was defeated, and then carved up in various mandates. The French mandate, the British mandate to rule parts of Syria, Palestine, Iraq, etc. So now the story changed a bit. The Arabs were not exercising self-government and the blessings of liberty because of Ottoman imperialism, but because of Western, British and French imperialism. And were only the boot lifted from off the backs of the Arabs, they would assume these blessings. And so it was that the United States consistently held an anti-imperial policy toward the Middle East urging the British and French to abandon their mandates and pressuring them to do so. I'm sure you have probably heard this lament. Once the United States was so popular in the Middle East, and now we're universally hated. How did we lose the affection of the Arab peoples? Well, here's one explanation. When they were the victims of Western imperialism, we opposed that imperialism. And graphically so during the 1956 Suez crisis, when the Brits went into Suez to take it from Nasser, and Eisenhower told them to get out, which without the support of the United States they had to do. And so we expected, without the imperial forces of France and Great Britain there, exhausted as they were, by the way, after World War II. They didn't have the resources to continue to stay, so they withdrew. But once again, it didn't seem as if the Arab peoples were taking advantage of this opportunity for self-government and liberty. It turns out, we discovered, that the problems in that area actually aren't a result of imperialism, but they're indigenous. Except now they were our problems. How did that problem manifest itself so clearly? Well, obviously one way was in that dirty word oil. As oil was becoming increasingly essential to the operation of the industrial world, the source of that oil had to be secured so that forces hostile to the United States and the industrialized world did not get control of it. I said that once, you know, on an Arab television show. And my Arab interlocutors turned to me and said, "Ha! So the conspiracy's true. It really is all about oil." And I turned to them and said, how could anything that obvious be a conspiracy? And it's nothing we ought to be ashamed of. We all need oxygen to breathe. Now, if we relied on an external source for our oxygen supply, an oxygen tank, for instance, who owned and controlled that oxygen tank, and the little meter that turned the oxygen on and off would be essential to our security in life. In fact, whoever controlled it could basically control us and tell us how to live. Since oil is the oxygen of the industrial world, we have a similar situation as the Middle East developed into the primary supplier of that oil. Since we had pressured Great Britain out of the Middle East, it was no longer there to secure that oil. So once again, that task fell to the United States. And it became the bipartisan, consistent policy of America, announced from President Truman on, that we would not tolerate a hostile foreign power attempting to take control of those oil supplies which were so strategic to the United States and our allies. You may recall when the Soviet Union made its lunge into Afghanistan in 1979, it was seen by some as a move toward the Middle East because now Soviet forces were on the border of Iran. So President Jimmy Carter, not known for a particularly strong foreign policy, reiterated it by saying, should a foreign power attempt